Lance, talk to us about we're going back and forth here, but the Western character. Is there really a Western character to the Iron Brigade? Western characterization versus the Eastern troops, for instance.
Yes, they were the only all-Western infantry brigade in the army, in the Eastern armies, which made them very strange. When they got out to the camps in Washington, everybody thought they were Indians, and they asked them questions like where do you put your scalps that you take, and can you shoot, and of course. The population of Wisconsin was mainly from other places, Pennsylvania, New York, and Kentucky and Tennessee. So they loved to play into this, that they were these rustic Westerners. Like they asked this one farmer, the big joke. They said, "What's that animal in the field?" And the farmer said, "Why, that's a cow." And he said, "A cow?" And they said, "Well, we've never seen a cow." He said, "Oh, we only milk buffalo in Wisconsin." And everybody, I go out east. I do that still. When somebody starts giving me a hard time, my stories get bigger and broader. So they were very Western. And as I said before, what I think is interesting about them is this Western people were really the first real Americans. It's the edge of the Industrial Revolution is just starting to pick up, and so you had education and you had a lot of mixing. In the Iron Brigade regiments, you had a lot of Native Americans. That enlisted illegally. They claimed they were French Canadians because French Canadians could enlist, but Native Americans couldn't. You find a lot of free blacks and runaways that served in African Americans who served in the Wisconsin regiments, and they were in these small clusters settlements around, and in Indiana too. And so they were Western and they were wild.
And so the Easterners were not that wild. They were.
They said no. One soldier in his letter, he said, "We have more fun than the Eastern boys." He said, "Well, we love to dance and sing more, and we put up with a lot of hardships too."
I'm going to show a Keith Rocco print in the cornfield, and we had Richard Slotkin here a couple of weeks ago to discuss his book on Antietam, and he was complimentary about the Iron Brigade's performance. He argues, though, that McClellan treated soldiers from Pope's army differently, and that's why I wanted to ask you about this. Is that true? And we've already talked about the opinion they had of McClellan and how that changed.
Yeah, he did. McClellan was supposedly gave them their name, the Iron Brigade. He saw them fighting up the National Road at South Mountain. And he said, "Who are those men?" And they're the Western men of Gibbon's brigade. And he said, "Why, they must be made of iron." At least that's the story McClellan told.
Not slightly suspect.
It is true. I've discovered what happened was there was a newspaper reporter who overheard some sort of exchange, and in his first account, he said he wrote about the Iron Brigade of the West.
Mm-hmm. I'm going to go back to the West, but with Lincoln and his fees guy, I found something out that I didn't know, how some of his fellow lawyers were not happy with the fees Lincoln was asking for.
No, that's true. He charged low fees, and I suppose he did it because his practice is incredibly mundane to begin with. We find that.
It was
it's just
casework.
Real ordinary stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And he wasn't a cause lawyer, and he's representing just regular folks. So I'm sure he was sensitive to the amount they could actually pay, and also the lower the fee, the more attractive as an attorney he might be. We don't know why he charged low fees, but he was ultimately called on the carpet by Judge Davis. Judge Davis was from Bloomington, was close to Lincoln, and very important in the story, was the judge for the entire circuit. He rode the whole 14 counties. And once he would hold a fictional, he made up the word, and I'm going to not quite get it right, but I'm close enough, orgmathorial court that he would have in the evenings when they're sitting around in the taverns, and they would call lawyers on the carpet for real and imagined offenses. Most of it was in humor. Mm-hmm. Well, they called Lincoln on the carpet because of his low fees, and he was convicted and ordered by, he was ordered by Davis to start charging higher fees. So it is true.
William Townsend didn't put that in his book, Lincoln Defendant.
No, that's right.
That one.
That's right.
Did Lincoln become a pretty prominent attorney, though, right?
Oh, yeah, very much so.
I mean, the myth of the poor old lawyer,
yeah,
counselor banging his way through
that part, he he wasn't a cause lawyer. He didn't represent just the common man. He represented the most important people in each of these towns. He was not the lawyer for the downtrodden. He was more the lawyer for the establishment, because he was what I love the most about Lincoln. He's out there slugging away, making a living, and the higher the economic status of the client, the more money he could pay. So he represented the leading citizens in most towns.
That house he had in Springfield was not a poor man's house.
That's correct.
He had it up second floor, and it wasn't just a poor country
Well,
living.
You know the story about the second floor. Supposedly he's out on the circuit, and keep in mind. Here's Mary Lincoln raising 4 kids with her husband gone 22 weeks a year riding the circuit. So let's give a tip of the hat to her at least for that. But supposedly she decides that the house isn't big enough, plans the addition, and it gets built while he's out on the road. And he comes home and he can't find his house. He's wandering around the neighborhood looking for his house because he doesn't recognize it. I don't know if that's true, but
I don't know if it's true either, but
it's a good story.
I want to believe it.
Yeah, I do too. Yeah.
Now we want to believe these stories. I agree with you on that. What was Lincoln's demeanor in court on the circuit?
Well, number one, again, the magnanimity. We never see him angry. These courts were really contentious, and we never see him where he reacts with anger or in any personal way. He acted with dignity, but he used humor tremendously with the juries, and his arguments are loaded with humor to help identify. So he told Herndon not to talk above the heads of the jurors, and George Herndon, and he always not talk down in the sense of patronizing, but make sure they understand the way you talk. So he was a humble man in court, and he behaved like a humble man. But Leonard Swett talks about you got to be careful with Lincoln, because he'll give away 6 points and you think you're doing pretty well, but he zeroes in on the 7th, and before you know it, if you think he's not a great lawyer, you'd be in the ditch on your back, is what he said.
He's sort of a Westerner, kind of humble and doesn't get too excited about it.
Oh, no question, no question. And if I may, about the Westerners and all that, the main characters in my book, the main character, of course, is Lincoln. But the guys that I love the most are those lawyers who are out there with him. These were talented, successful, really good lawyers, and they're in an adventuresome time, putting it on the line, and just a wonderful bunch of guys.
Even though it was casework and debt work that was the predominant part of his load,
Right.
was he involved in any evolving law, cutting-edge law?
Very much so.
Give us an example.
The 2 I think of, one was actually Herndon handled most of the case. We don't give Herndon enough credit. He's supposedly this bag man for Lincoln. He was a better lawyer than that. But there's a case in Logan County where the 2 conductors on the railroad, a man didn't have the money and then wouldn't pay for his ticket when he got on the train, so they threw him off the train. He was badly injured. They hired Lincoln to sue the railroad. Here's the guy that's supposed to be the railroad lawyer. Lincoln takes the case, and Herndon mainly. They go to the Supreme Court of Illinois and establish the rule of law that a corporation can be liable for the acts of its agents, which is very fundamental law now. Secondly, he represented a man who fell through the wooden sidewalks in Springfield, and they sued the municipality and established the principle that a city can be negligent in carrying out its duties to the public. And then he, of course, in his transportation cases, that's a long story, but he represented the railroads as the wave of the future versus the rivers, which are the wave of the past. So, no, he was very much involved, not just in small stuff, but big stuff, too.
Herndon said that Lincoln thought more than any man he ever knew.
Right.
And Lincoln himself said, I'm never easy now when I am handling a thought till I have bounded it north and bounded it south and bounded it east and bounded it west.
That's a great quote. I've never heard that.
That's what he said. And he was young. He started to do that. And then he also went on to say that he could then be able himself to explain it to someone else. That's basically what he was saying. So you have numbers of observations of Lincoln deep in this thought in your book.
That's what's so wonderful about the circuit. And if any of us here think of how much time do we sit around and think? Never. You never have time to think. And Lincoln's on this horse riding endless miles through the prairie with nothing to do but think. And his partners or his comrades on the circuit talk about him wandering off by himself, and they knew to leave him alone. and he could brood and think. And
Well, you also
mull
say in the
things
book
over.
that even in court or amongst his friends, when he outside of the court, they'd be talking, and he's somewhere else.
Right. That was amazing. And they allowed him that. They tolerated that aspect of him, which was actually kind of peculiar.
John in Ann Arbor. Thank you, John, for the question. Just wanted to say how really interesting aspects of the Civil War in Lincoln's life. No matter how much I read on Lincoln, these discussions always add to my knowledge. My question, when Lincoln was on the circuit, do you think it was more strict legal interpretation of the law, or were they more of a persuasive, argumentative type of trial?
That's a great question, and I would say more the latter than the former. There wasn't. Herndon said he was not a case. He was strictly a case lawyer, which meant he didn't study the law except as he had to for each particular case. So there was an awful lot of fly by the seat of your pants practice in those days.
What was the first battle the Iron Brigade was in?
That's a good question, and it gets you into all sorts of trouble.
Good. That's
The
my
first,
answer.
the first battle was probably Bull Run, because the Second Wisconsin came and fought in the Battle of Bull Run, and then later was brigaded with these other wild Western boys who came in. They really were kept out of action for a year, which is what I think was important to them in their development, because they took them a year to learn to be soldiers. They fought their first battle August 28th, 1862, just before Second Bull Run, at a place they called Gainesville, but is now popular known today as Bronner's Farm, when they were jumped by Stonewall Jackson's men and spent 90 minutes at dusk exchanging shots in an open field with a line 70 yards away. They got shot up pretty bad. They were in 4 major battles in the space of less than 3 weeks.
Wow.
And in that, they lost 1,700 men out of the 4 regiments. And then the 24th Michigan comes after Antietam. They loved the 24th Michigan. They call them the Featherbeds, because they said they came from Michigan. They came late and brought everything from home, including their feather beds. But of course, the 24th Michigan earns its hats at Gettysburg on the first day. So,
Well, now, you wrote a whole book on the Iron Brigade at Gettysburg. What did they do to deserve that, for those who don't know?
well,
Gettysburg was a battle, by the way.
simply they held up. They were the first infantry thrown into the line. They were run into the fight on the first day, and literally held up the Confederate Army until almost 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And it was that time that allowed the Union Army to concentrate south of Gettysburg on Cemetery Hill and Cemetery Ridge and the Culpsell. They went into the battle 1,883 men, and that night, that night when they gathered at the rally point, there were 491 left.
My gosh.
Can you imagine? The 24th Michigan suffered the highest losses. They went in with 490 some men, and they only had 90 around the flags that night.
Wow.
But they held that line. They held a line because there was a mistake. A German officer came up and gave them orders they had to hold Cemetery Hill at all costs, and the Germans spoke such broken English that they thought Cemetery Hill was where they were fighting, so they stayed longer than they should have.
Mm-hmm. Well, of course, I talked about your book, but it's always easier to sell a book with the word Gettysburg in it.
Yes.
So why not?
And
Well,
Bull
the
Run,
history,
and
or Lincoln. The history of the brigade is normally told, I guess, fizzles a bit after Gettysburg. Why?
yeah, basically because it lost its Western identity. A Pennsylvania regiment was added to the brigade right after Gettysburg, and Alan Nolan, in his history in 1961, pretty much wrapped it up he writes a few pages about the rest of the war. But I had the chance and the enjoyment to actually read through and write all of the stuff from 1864-65, which I think is just as intriguing. It's a different Iron Brigade. Mm-hmm. Full of drafted men and bounty men, and it's not the same Iron Brigade of Gettysburg or the same regiments, and they fought a different type of battle, and it's how they reacted to that, and when they came home, what a great it's just they kind of lost. They came home and their reputation was established in the Army, but nobody knew, and it wasn't until Bruce Catton wrote Mr. Lincoln's Army, and he used Dawes'
The
book.
newspapers weren't really
Well,
blowing
they
them
in
up?
this, yeah, but you know, they're from Wisconsin, you know, it's not Boston or Philadelphia or New York or Washington where all the big reunions are held and all the big generals are. So they always felt that they never got credit for what they did. Thank you, because they wrote a lot to each other, and
Yeah, and you
and I
got
was
a book
able
on
to,
it.